Yeah, I think one thing that this question brings up for me is the role of your family in reinforcing or rejecting an identity. I grew up in a family that had a lot of bipolar disorder in it. We didn't necessarily talk about it or see it as a valuable family trait, but we were proud to be Italian. We ate a lot of Italian food. A lot of families reject kids, when they present as a different gender or part of the LGBTQ community. So I think it's worth thinking about what are the messages we get from our families around our identities, disability and otherwise, and how can we help families learn to embrace all these identities and reinforce them, in part as a way of keeping the family together, but also helping their young person live into their identities as an adult and as a young person. And I feel like in the deaf community, when you see multiple generations of deaf folks, that's an example where that deaf cultural identity gets reinforced and strengthened. And I think that there's a lot that the rest of the disability community can learn from the deaf community. John, did you want to add anything on this?
I just wanted to briefly mention an article that Kamara Jones from Morehouse School of Medicine wrote almost 10 years ago now, looking at similarities in disability and race. And I'll see if I can dig it out and post it in the chat. But she does talk about how both disability and race are social constructs that rely heavily on interaction with not just the environment, but systems that have systematically discriminated against the different populations. And yes, the struggles are very different, but importantly, they occur in both of those communities at the individual level and also at the community level. So I'll see if I can dig that up.
Carissa or Morgan, anything you all want to add? You're good? All right. So the next question kind of, we're being convened by the University of Kentucky Human Development Institute today, and they do many things at that institute. One of them is educate educators and try to help schools be as good as they can be for children with disabilities. So this question for the panel is, do you think middle schools and high schools are doing enough to help young people develop a strong disability identity before they graduate? And if not, what are some ideas you have of what schools could be doing to help with this identity development?
I'll go. First of all, I think that it shouldn't even start in middle school or high school. They're not doing enough in elementary school. They see somebody with a disability coming up in elementary school as what's wrong with that child. And I will tell a very personal story in a very, in a short amount of time, and still a very raw story. My son has been diagnosed with some mental health issues and some behavioral issues, both ADHD and disruptive behavioral disorder. Those are disabilities that I wasn't familiar with. I'm more familiar with the physical side of things. So I've had to learn as I go along. But recently, he, as a part of his behaviors, found some medication and took it to school. And immediately CPS was called, and the worker basically said to me that the school is really concerned about his behavior. What can we do to fix this? What supports do you have? What can we do to fix this? I love what Beverly said. We don't need to fix the child. what is missing that he needs. I'm getting him, he's getting behavioral therapy, he's got a case manager, he's got counseling in school, he's got an aide, all of those things, but they're still looking at fixing my son. My son is a beautiful 7-year-old. He is funny. He is smart beyond his years. He is a person. And they're still looking at fixing him. And not only that, they said a strength in our environment was that I had my husband there to support me if I ever needed help with him. My husband looked at that worker and was like, she could do, he listens to her more than he does me. So we're having to educate these folks. I don't understand that. So it needs to start in elementary school. And not only that, we need to hook the individuals up with their peers as soon as possible. Let them know that it's okay. Hook them up with that representation. We need more of that. Hook them up with peer groups in independent living centers or any other genre that you would look at. Just let them be a part of that whole so they can develop that pride early, not that something's wrong with them.
Perfectly said.
Yeah, Morgan, you want to add in terms of what schools could be doing better?
Not really. Probably just like she said, have them be with their peers, get them involved in sports and stuff like that. Just to show people that even though we have a disability, we're still human. We're normal, just like everyone else.
And Morgan, did you have your disability during school, during childhood?
No, sir. I was born with abnormal legs, and when I was real young, like they were webbed. So
So you had it from birth, it sounds like. But I
Yes,
guess
sir.
one question I've had for you is when you were going through school, did you ever have a teacher that had a strong disability identity? And do you feel like the school would have encouraged teachers to be out and open with their disability identities?
Good question. I never had a teacher like that had a disability identity. And what was the rest of your question? Sorry.
Like maybe there were teachers that had depression or anxiety or autism or dyslexia or something. Do you think they would have been encouraged by the administration at the school to talk about their disabilities with their students?
I am not sure how to answer that, but that would be cool if they were comfortable to explain their disability. Maybe like my peers would also be understanding of disability, because like when I was younger, I hated going places because I knew that I would have a lot of people stare at me and yell, "Why does he have robot legs?" So yeah, so I wish, like she said, that it could be, I guess, more or taught in elementary school that we're nothing to be afraid of.
Anything Keith or John or Bev you all want to add on advice for schools?
I'll just give a quick unsolicited plug that UK's very own Human Development Institute had a wonderful pilot project a couple years ago with a peer program where they matched in pilot schools, and they were, I believe, middle schools, and then it moved into high school. They matched typical peers with disabled peers in groups, and it was a really neat project. I think there needs to be more of that, more inclusion. Because what I see in schools, and I'm not in schools very often, but my kid is in grade school, 4th grade right now, and I have friends with kids in school, and what I see is a lot of more of the same, segregation, and seclusion and separate activities. And what we need is people making friends, natural supports, and some of that, and yes, also with other people with disabilities, but we want to make sure that those non-disabled students are involved too, and that's a great learning experience for those students.
Agreed.
Bev?
There are a lot of things that they could and should be doing, but let's not put lipstick on a pig, okay? First, there are some things that they must stop doing. Schools must end the practice of restraining and secluding children. Kids are being hurt and they're being killed. It's so clearly and blatantly wrong, and yet it continues. Before real progress can be made, we've got to end the violence and help kids recover from the trauma. And once that's done, we're coming for your behavior clip charts.
Well said, Bev. Thank you. John, anything you want to add on this one?
Just would strongly encourage people to read the recent New York Times article on this in a grade school context, that the whole behavior issue is leading to kids being removed from classrooms, their class days shortened, their school years shortened, and it's all about the disruption factor. Language from the administrators, not my language, but very little adaptation to the child and the child's needs, and certainly not that sense of belonging that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, at the beginning of the year, my son was kept in front of a computer and he didn't have to do any of the other typical work because that's what kept him quiet. So that needs to stop. Absolutely.
Thank you. So let's now take this into higher ed, places like the University of Kentucky. Some campuses have moved from having a disabled student services office to having a disability cultural center that sometimes is more connected to the academic mission of the university. And I think one of the benefits of having a cultural center is it can start to build a stronger disability cultural identity for students while they're on campus and expose them to some of the things that Keith talked about that he's inspired by, that a lot of folks with disabilities never learn about when they're in school. But I'm wondering if you all have thoughts in terms of what institutions of higher education can be doing to cultivate disability pride and disability cultural identity for their students, their faculty, their staff, and their alumni.
Making things accessible for everyone. There's like I work on campus sometime, and there's like some places that are kind of accessible, but then like accessible doors are all the way in the back, or like there's places where there's like giant stairs and like plenty of room to make a ramp, but there's no ramp. Just makes it seem like people with disabilities aren't welcome or something.
Good point.
I can't speak to UK directly because I didn't go there and I don't work there, but I think, Andy, you really hit it on the head, and I kind of have the same perception that really what we need on our universities is more akin to a cultural center than just accommodations. I went, it wasn't UK, I went to another institution of higher learning a few months back, and they have a great cultural center where they house their LGBTQ program, their Black African American program, their Latino program. They're all in the same building. There's some great synergy, and my first question was, why aren't the disability people in here too? Well, they're over in that building over there because all they do is get accommodations for the students. But we could have so much more. And I would be remiss as a UK sports fan if I did not say one thing that we could do on campus or slightly off campus is maybe burn some couches on the ADA anniversary. That's a Kentucky thing. You win a sports event, you burn a couch.
Other thoughts, John or Bev or Carissa? John?
Yeah, at the risk of repeating myself, I think it's creating those spaces where people feel welcome, and even within our own network, those UCEDs, those University Centers of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, which often are not limited to serving individuals with developmental disabilities, but many, and in many cases, all parts of the community. Every one of those has a consumer advisory council made up of individuals with disabilities and families. I think just learning about those centers and the work of those centers could go a long way to fostering a positive identity for those who are open to it. Get them engaged in the LEND program, which is a workforce development program for clinical and other professionals that are located in 60 different college campuses around the country, but there's also roles in those programs which are leadership and disability competency programs for advocates living with disabilities and their family members as well. So I think it's also making sure that we're doing a good job of connecting students to the opportunities available to them that they may not know exist.
So definitely yes on cultural centers and affinity groups. I think it's also advisable to have a good, solid disability studies department with a core of critical disability studies courses, and it should be as interdisciplinary as possible. Critical disability studies looks at the cultural and philosophical aspects of disability in society, why we've decided to categorize certain things as disability and others not, and what that means and what are the consequences to people, especially to people who have other marginalized identities. A final thought here is that there should be no group or project focused on disability that does not have people with disabilities in decision-making roles. Don't light it up blue this April. Listen to the voices of disabled people first, not as an afterthought.
Well said. Carissa, anything you want to add related to higher ed?
No, I think everything's been beautifully said. When I went to school, I was a part of student support services, which had a lot of people with disabilities in it. Sadly, that program is no longer on Murray State's campus, and it wasn't focused on accommodations. That was another office. So I would really like to see cultural centers and classes that talk about disability and even intersectionality.
So, the title for this panel today was "What's in a Name?" And I get the sense that there are parts of the disability community that don't like the word disability. I remember getting invited to speak at Gallaudet University on their Disability Day, And at Gallaudet University, Disability Day is for the students who are deaf and also have cerebral palsy or some other kind of disability. But the deaf students, for the most part, don't see themselves as disabled. And I remember asking the students, how many of you self-identify as disabled? And out of an audience of 100 students, maybe 3 raised their hands. And I asked the folks who didn't raise their hands, give me a definition of disability. Like, how do you think of that term? And I heard a lot of negative definitions of disability. And I just encourage them to think about, why they don't like that word and why the deaf word doesn't have the negative connotations for them. So I guess, it's an interesting question. If we're trying to develop deaf pride, disability pride, and various identities within the disability community, is the word disability the right word that brings us all together? Do you have thoughts about when and how that word might evolve? I'm just wondering what people think about the concept of disability pride and whether that's going to stand the test of time.
I hope it does, because I like the unity of it and the feeling of strength in numbers. I do know some autistic people who say they don't have a disability, and I respect those people, but I disagree. I see disability through more of a social model and neurodiversity lens, but I think it's definitely a disability.
Thanks, Bev. Other thoughts? Keith?
I think language evolves, and our language has evolved within the disability culture, right? And I think it's important to recognize that not everyone rallies around the same words, right? I wouldn't ever dare say a person with autism, because most of that group prefers autistic, right? Same thing with the capital D, culturally deaf individuals. They see their deafness as a cultural aspect, not necessarily as a disability. They communicate differently, not worse, not anything like that. And I think that there's room for all of us under the same umbrella. What we call that umbrella can be discussed, but I think once more people start moving towards a cultural identity, as our friends in the deaf community have, we may have some more unity there. And I think disability pride, what is in a word? Earlier I said, what's the opposite of pride? It's shame. And I think as more people with disabilities start to see their disabilities as a natural part of the life cycle, and that there's this community that they can be involved with and see deaf storytellers, which is an absolutely amazing thing to watch, or go to a ballet performance where someone is in a wheelchair, or whatever we're going to do, that we can rally around the same way that the disability community rallied around the ADA. It took everyone coming together to get that passed, and we had to get some of our differences we had to put aside for the greater good, but not the most important ones, right? There were things that were non-starters, and I think that as Bev said, there's strength in numbers, right? So I too hope that the word disability pride that term can continue to grow and be embraced. And if someone comes up with another word that they like better, then let me know. I'm not the decider, but I like to be up with the current stuff. I have a fear, the FOMO, as they say, the fear of missing out. So I just want to know what we're calling ourselves tomorrow. That's fine.
Sounds good. John or Carissa or Morgan, you want to add anything on the word?
Like the disability word too, even if, is it deficit based? Sure, if you want to look at it that way, but it's, I own it. It's who I am. Not going away because of it. I think our language will evolve over time, just like we've abandoned words that we no longer use. Many of those words were imposed on us. I don't know what that word would be if we're not going to call ourselves disabled. But I'm with Keith. I'm open to entertaining alternatives, but I don't know what that would be. Right.
Yeah, I remember when I was at the American Association of People with Disabilities, people often asked us, how do you define the word disability? And I said, I saw it more as a political word than a medical word. It's a thing that brings people together as a voting bloc, as a market, as a interest group, as a peer network. And it's our political word. Our civil rights law is called the Americans with Disabilities Act. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. These are political documents that were asked for and brought to bear by a political movement. So I guess my strong feeling is until the disability movement rallies around another word, it will continue to be our political word. But I do respect that there are subgroups within the community that may never embrace that word. And that doesn't mean that we don't need to work with them as part of our movement. So the last question that I had for the panel is, and I think some of this has come up earlier, but do you have any advice for folks in the audience who may be starting to self-identify, but are still trying to find their footing in this disability identity? Is there an art to owning one's disability identity, and how do you learn to do that well?
I think for me, it took a long time. It evolved and it continues to evolve. I don't know everything about every disability. I'm newer to the mental health side, for example, like I alluded to earlier. But I think the best way to grow in that journey is by example and just listening and getting the positivity from those peers and those people that came before you that can help you be comfortable with joining the movement.
Keith?
I had the great privilege of working for a Center for Independent Living for 14 years. So I was very lucky to be around a lot of people with disabilities who were doing a lot of really cool things. And that made it really easy for me to find disability pride because, my club feet is a congenital disability. I was born with it. And as a young person, I struggled with my disability and my self-identity. That's really hard to do when you're in a place where over half of the employees have some type of disability and everyone's doing what they need to do and living their lives. And so I think having those examples really helped me. But I think too is really that first step is looking at what type of internalized ableism that you're living with, because I was living with internalized ableism before I got to where I am, and I had to work through that So if someone is out there right now listening and struggling, I would say you are worthy of love and friendship and community. And we're here, and we have fun a lot of times despite our struggles. And so, you know, practicing that self-love and self-acceptance, as corny as that sounds, you know, Andy, that poem you read, it takes practice, right? I didn't get there overnight. I got there through a journey.
Thanks, Keith. John?
Yeah, find somebody to talk to. Ideally, someone your own age, but you know, there's, as Keith said, we're here. I think anybody on this call would be willing to talk to anybody about where they are in that journey and link you up with a mentor to show you the possibilities of life and everything that it has to offer by embracing or even just moving further on your path toward pride in your disability identity.
Bev or Morgan, anything you want to add?
I think you all
Okay.
covered it, but yeah, it's a little different for everyone. But for me, it started with a lot of reading because that's how I learn best, and then meeting other people with the disabilities I have.
Great, thanks. Bev, Morgan, you started to say something, but I think you were on mute. Very good.
Oh no, I wasn't. I was just reading over. What do you have it? Just like it was when I was a lot younger, it was definitely hard because I didn't feel like anybody had the same, like I didn't have anyone that looked like me had prosthetics or nothing. So it was definitely hard. And then when I got older, I like realized that this is who I am. This is me, and I own that. And I feel like once you do that, it gets easier. Like I said earlier, my disability isn't going anywhere. It's here to stay. So just own up to it and work with what I have. And I've had many opportunities. Like I feel like everything happens for a reason, and everything and everyone has a purpose. And when I was younger, I didn't know that now, but now I do. So I feel like just realizing that I have this disability, it's not going anywhere, but I can either be down on myself about it, or I can just continue on with life.
Well said. So, you know, I think we've gotten through all the questions. I think this has been a really rich discussion, lots of great feedback in the chat. Just wanted to see if anybody has any closing comments, anything you want to speak to that we haven't already spoken about.
I would only like to share my standard disclaimer, which has become necessary because I'm so often misinterpreted. It is not my intention to speak for every autistic person. We each have our own unique ways of experiencing the world. When I say autistic people are like this or like that, I mean in general, as you might say, children like going to amusement parks. It doesn't mean every single one. However, when I say that autistic people should be respected and that their human rights must be honored, then I do mean everyone. Every single one.
Thanks, Bev. I guess, one thing I would add just for, I think probably if there's 130 people on this Zoom, pretty much everybody on this Zoom has a disabled person in their life that they love. I'm just gonna assume that. So I think one of the messages of this panel is if you love a disabled person in your life, try to help them love themselves. And that for me is really what disability pride is about. It's learning to be comfortable in who you are, to love who you are, and to not allow other people to define you, but to define yourself. And I do think that disability pride and disability pride parades and things like that are really important. The White House had a disability pride celebration in September. I think it was the first disability pride celebration attended by a president of the United States. And I think they're going to do it every year. And they do a gay pride celebration every year. But we haven't had an administration before this one that did a disability event at the White House celebrating our identity until last year. So in some ways, disability pride is learning from other pride movements, especially the LGBTQ pride movement. And it's not about passing legislation. It's about really getting comfortable in our own skin, building a culture around our identity. And I think it's more powerful than legislation. When I say this, somebody spent a lot of time focused on laws. So I'm excited about the evolving disability pride movement. I'm grateful to President Biden for supporting it and the First Lady and everybody who came to that event. And I think our movement is going to be stronger, and it will save lives, as people learn to live in their identities and love themselves. So I guess I'll close with that and turn it back to Walt. Walt, if you want to give any closing comments for the Human Development Institute.
But thank you. As advertised, this has been great. It's been an honor and a privilege for all of you to join us today. Thank you. Thank you all for taking the time out of your day to share your experiences and expertise with us. Thank you for an informative panel. Be well and stay safe.